Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Senator Paul, thank you for joining us. And I want to start with what the president said, fine-tuned machine over this first month. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And from where I sit, we've done a lot of good things. You know, we repealed regulations for the first time in 20 years using the Congressional Review Act. 3 regulations that were going to cost the economy hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of jobs. That is big progress. We're on schedule to repeal Obamacare. Big progress. His cabinet picks, from a conservative point of view, have exceeded my expectations. I think Scott Pruitt's going to be great at EPA. I think we're really going to do some conservative things. Supreme Court Justice, somebody I could have picked. So I'm actually very, very pleased with where we are.
Now, part of the kind of chaos theory stems from the president's words, what he said. I want to play something he said last night at his rally.
You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
Now, that was in a riff where he was talking about terror attacks. So we scrubbed the record, scrubbed news reports out of Sweden. Do you have any idea what he was talking about?
Well, I think there have been some altercations. There was a New Year's Eve altercation, I think a year ago, where there was quite a few things that were happening that did involve refugee populations, and I believe that was in Sweden. But, you know, I think that anybody who thinks that it's been seamless and no bumps in the road in Germany with allowing 1 million people to come in, no, I think there have been problems. And I think there are legitimate concerns that get sloughed over here. For example, World War I, World War II, immigration came to a grinding halt in our country during these wars. And the question I ask is, if someone wants to come from Aleppo tomorrow, how do you know who they are? There's almost nothing left in Aleppo. I don't know that there's paperwork. I don't know that you can ask people in Syria, where there is a dysfunctional government, to give you the legitimate paperwork on people. So I think it is very, very difficult to vet people from there, Yemen, Sudan, all of these places that are engaged in war. I think those are legitimate concerns for our national security.
But Senator, I'm asking you about what the president said at his rally. He said what is happening last night in Sweden. We heard from the former prime minister of Sweden, who tweeted after that, Sweden, terror attack? What has he been smoking? Questions abound. I mean, isn't there a point of credibility? I mean, we also heard the president in the press conference say that he had the biggest electoral win since Reagan. It's not even close. So what isn't there a credibility question?
You know,
here?
I think there are there are other people that have looked at this, and they say there are sort of 2 levels you can analyze this administration on. One, words and Twitter, and other on actions. And I tend to look at the actions. And like I say, I have my quibbles here and there with things that are said, and yet I'm really pleased that we repealed a regulation that was going to be very, very damaging to my state. The regulation, I went to the White House this week to see him sign. The repeal would have cost 77,000 jobs in the coal industry. So I'm very, very happy. That would have never happened probably under half a dozen other Republican nominees. So, I mean, not everyone is perfect, but I think there's a lot of good things, and we shouldn't lose sight of the good things from a conservative point of view of what's happening in Washington.
No doubt. But I want to play something that you said a year ago, January. Now, obviously, at this point, you were running against Donald Trump. So you were in a different position. But I want to play something you said on the nightly show with Larry Wilmore.
What worries me most about Trump, other than all the other crazy things, is that I believe that he wants power. And I believe, from my point of view, that power corrupts, and that the whole purpose of our founding fathers in our country was to contain power.
So when you listen to the press conference on Thursday, and when you hear his attacks on the judiciary, and you hear his attacks on the press, do you still have any of those concerns?
You know, I have a great deal of concern for any president and the amount of power they accumulate versus Congress. So I'm a stickler about the idea of separation of powers. When you go back to James Madison, and he said we would pit ambition against ambition to try to check and keep things in balance, I think that's incredibly important. And I think all presidents have tried to gain too much power. But this is more about the words and the personality of President Trump. I was very, very concerned about President Obama and how much executive order and how much executive legislative power he tried to exert. But I think I want to be, and I think Congress will be, a check on any executive, Republican or Democrat, that tries to grasp too much power. And really, a lot of the fault is not only presidents trying to take too much power, it's Congress giving up too much power. We write only skeletons of bills, sort of outline of bills. Even Obamacare was just sort of an outline, 2,700-page outline. Then we sent it up there, and the rest of it's written by bureaucrats, the permanent bureaucratic state. And so, yes, there always has to be a pushback, and I think there needs to be a great deal more pushback from Congress on any president, but not just this president. I think probably 100 years where the presidents have been usurping too much power.
And I think it's fair to say that you are second to none in the Senate when it comes to fighting for civil liberties. So let me ask you about specifically what he is saying about the press. He is saying now that the news media is the enemy of the American people. You agree with that?
It's not something that I would say. I would say that there is bias, and I think it's fair to point out that there is bias in the media on both sides, both right and left, and that it's very hard to find objective news because we've gotten, particularly as you watch cable news, it's so dominated by opinion. And we are more polarized, and some of that comes from the people and some of that comes from the media. But I would say that I don't see in his criticism somehow, people think that the separation of powers means that the president can't criticize the judiciary. No, it has nothing to do with that. That's more of sort of political sensibilities, but has nothing to do with the Constitution or separation of powers. We don't like it. We may say it sort of treads on things, but the separation of powers is about legislative powers. It isn't about discussion or words. So I would separate, once again, words from actual real legislative action. If someone tries to put limits on the press, I'll be the first one standing up for the right of press, left and right, to continue saying and being part of the discussion and forwarding the discussion.
What do you make of McCain's statement that we're creeping towards a situation where people are potentially supportive of dictatorship in this country? Is that over the top, or is there a concern?
I think Senator McCain's perspective is colored by his disagreements with President Trump on foreign policy. If I were to look at foreign policy, I would say John McCain's been wrong on just about everything over the last 4 decades. He advocated for the Iraq War, which I think destabilized the Middle East. If you look at the map, there's probably at least 6 different countries where John McCain has advocated for having U.S. boots on the ground. John McCain's complaint is we're either not at war somewhere, or if we're at war, we leave too soon. So we're not there soon enough, and he wants us to stay forever wherever we send troops. So that's a foreign policy that is at odds with President Trump. And also the idea of engagement, the idea of foreign policy realism, I think fits more neatly with President Trump. And with John McCain, the neoconservative label of let's make the world safe for democracy and we're going to topple every regime hasn't worked. I mean, our intervention to destabilize the Assad regime has really made the chaos worse in Syria. And if you were to get rid of Assad today, I would actually worry about the 2 million Christians that are protected by Assad. So I think it's more a foreign policy debate, and Trump and McCain are on opposite sides of that debate. And I tend to sympathize more with the president that we need a change. We don't need to continue to have a regime change throughout the world, nation building. It's expensive, and we don't have enough money to rebuild our own country if we're rebuilding everyone else's countries.
But just to clarify, what McCain said specifically is dictators get started by limiting freedom of the press. I imagine you agree with that.
Well, the thing is I don't agree with his analysis and applying that to the president. I haven't seen any legislation coming forward that wants to limit the press. I see President Trump expressing his opinion rather forceful in his own, his own distinct way. But I see no evidence that anybody's putting forward any kind of legislation to limit the press.
Okay.
So I think people, this is colored by John McCain's disagreement with President Trump. It all is. Everything that he says about the president is colored by his own personal dispute he's got running with President Trump. And it should be taken with a grain of salt because John McCain's the guy that's advocated for war everywhere. He would bankrupt the nation. And actually, we're very lucky John McCain's not in charge because I think we'd be in perpetual war.
He certainly did talk about changing the libel laws during the campaign. I want to turn to the firing of Michael Flynn. One of the candidates that the White House is now talking about as a possible replacement is John Bolton. Now, you adamantly opposed him when he was up for confirmation for another position. This obviously does not require confirmation, but would you have concerns about John Bolton as National Security Advisor?
Yeah, I think the problem with John Bolton is he disagrees with President Trump's foreign policy. He would be closer to John McCain's foreign policy. John Bolton still believes the Iraq War was a good idea. He still believes that regime change is a good idea. He still believes that nation building is a good idea. So, no, I think John Bolton would be much closer to McCain than Trump. And I think that his history of sort of acting on his own, my fear is that secret wars would be developing around the globe. And so, no, I think he'd be a bad choice.
Okay, let's turn to Obamacare. You tweeted back in January that the president, quote, fully supports my plan to replace Obamacare the same day we repeal it. We've heard some mixed signals out of the White House. Are you still confident that that's the case, that he fully supports your plan?
Yes, I've discussed this with the vice president. I've discussed this with Congressman Price, or now Secretary Price. I think we need to do repeal and replace on the same day, but I think we need to do complete repeal. My worry now is that many people are talking about a partial repeal of Obamacare. If you only repeal part of it and you leave in some sort of Obamacare light, which some are talking about, my fear is the situation actually gets worse. Right now in the insurance markets, we have sort of a disaster unfolding, a downward spiral, adverse selection, premiums in the individual market going through the roof. People can't afford insurance, and insurance companies are losing hundreds of millions of dollars. If you repeal part of Obamacare, if you get rid of the individual mandate but keep some of the ideas that people can still buy insurance after they're sick, the situation gets, extraordinarily worse. And so what we're seeing now could be tenfold greater if you only repeal part of Obamacare. So about a year ago, we voted to repeal the whole thing. My advocacy and most of the conservatives that I'm talking to the House and the Senate are saying we've got to at least do what we did in 2015, and we're not into like replacing it with some federal programs. We want to repeal the whole thing and then have a replacement that helps to lower insurance costs for everybody.
And are you convinced that the White House is on board with that? I mean, the president said there'd be a plan in March, but he's also talked about, maybe this would take more than a year to unfold.
Well, the thing is yes, all of it takes a while to unfold. Legislatively, I think we will repeal Obamacare within the next 1 to 2 months. I'm pretty sure of that. Now, there's a debate whether we repeal the whole thing or whether or not, some of the big government Republicans want to keep Obamacare light. The conservatives were ready for a fight. The House Freedom Caucus said they will not vote for partial repeal. I'm in the same camp. I'm not voting for partial repeal. It's got to be the same thing or better than what we voted on in 2015. And so there is going to be a discussion over how much we repeal, but I do believe it is repealed in the next 1 to 2 months. And the replacement part, unfortunately, requires the Democrats to help, and I don't see any help coming from Democrats. But we should offer the American public less expensive insurance, and that does require a replacement bill.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you about something else the president said just last night about his plan for infrastructure, an infrastructure bill. Listen to this.
We need members of both parties to join hands and work with us to pass a $1 trillion infrastructure plan to build new roads and bridges and airports and tunnels and highways and railways all across our great nation.
Okay, now I know you have a plan that would bring back through repatriation stuff that's money that's held overseas that would fund road repair maybe to the tune of $100 or $200 billion over 5 years. What's your take on a $1 trillion infrastructure plan? Would you stand up and stop that?
I think we have to debate the amount, but I am for rebuilding our infrastructure, and I have a bill that would encourage the American profit overseas to come home. There's about $2 trillion overseas, and I have a bipartisan bill that I will try to present to the president that I think will help in this method, but we have to pay for it. I'm not for borrowing the money, but I'm open to listening to what he has planned. I'm also wanting to offer some ideas I have for taking the repatriation money and putting it directly into a road fund.
But $1 trillion borrowed, you're not on board.
We have to see how we're going to pay for it, and it sounds like a number so large that it would probably incur more borrowing, and I'm not for that. It has to be paid for, And I do have a pay for, which is lowering this tax to bring American profit
Yep.
home. And I'd put that directly into the road fund.
Okay, so one final question. I know it's early, so please forgive me, but the president did have a campaign rally, a re-election campaign rally last night. And a headline in the Lexington Herald Leader, one of the top papers in your state, caught my attention. Rand Paul in 2020. He's showing that independent streak again. So tell me, Senator Paul,
Yeah.
do you rule out running against
Yeah.
Donald Trump in the Republican primary in 2020?
Yeah, I have no intention of doing that. My goal right now is to actually help him. He's a Republican president. He's doing a lot of things that conservatives are for, I'm for. And so my goal is to help Kentucky by repealing regulations that are killing our coal industry. And I think on that, we're very much allied.
All right, Senator Rand Paul, we'll ask you that question in a little while.